The sharp sound of ripping paper broke through the hum of a busy airport terminal. Naomi Carter, a poised black woman dressed in a sleek gray business suit, stared in disbelief at the shredded remains of her passport in the hands of a uniformed white police officer. His stern face betrayed no hint of remorse as he crumpled the pieces in his palm, declaring with chilling certainty, "This is fake. You're not going anywhere." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching as a small crowd began to form around them. She tried to keep her voice steady, though anger and fear swirled inside her. "This is a diplomatic passport issued by the United Nations," she said firmly. The officer scoffed, his lip curling as he gestured to the badge on his chest. "Do you think I don't know a fake when I see one? Where did you even get this, some street vendor?" Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and Naomi felt her cheeks flush not with shame but with fury. She clenched her fists, her calm veneer cracking. The officer leaned closer, his voice dropping into a condescending drawl. "You're under investigation for attempted fraud. Step aside, or we'll make this harder than it needs to be." As the man's hand hovered near his holster, Naomi's mind raced. This couldn't be happening, not like this. She had worked too hard, overcome too much. A surge of defiance rose in her chest, but before she could speak, another officer stepped forward, holding a pair of cuffs. The crowd murmured louder, their faces a mix of shock, confusion, and silent judgment. Naomi's pulse quickened. How had it come to this? Just 2 hours earlier, Naomi had been in a cab, staring out at the city streets as she headed to the airport. She was returning to New York after 3 weeks in Geneva, where she had attended a series of intense negotiations on international development policies. At just 34 years old, Naomi had risen to become one of the youngest diplomats in the United Nations, a role she carried with both pride and immense responsibility. Her flight was scheduled for 4 p.m., and she was running late. She had barely enough time to double-check her passport, ticket, and documents. As the cab pulled up to the terminal, she paid the driver and hustled inside, her heels clicking briskly against the polished floor. Naomi had always loved the airport's energy, a mix of urgency and anticipation, of people crossing paths from all corners of the globe. It was one of the few places where she felt a part of something bigger than herself. After clearing security, she made her way to the diplomatic check-in counter. The agent scanned her passport, smiling politely as they handed her a boarding pass. "Safe travels, Miss Carter," they said, nodding toward the gates. But as Naomi approached Gate 14, her day took an unexpected turn. A man in uniform stood near the boarding area, scrutinizing passengers as they entered. Naomi barely glanced at him, assuming he was just doing his job. When she handed her boarding pass to the attendant, the officer stepped in front of her. "Mom, I need to see your ID," he said, his tone sharp. Caught off guard, Naomi hesitated. "I just showed my passport at check-in," she replied. "This is a random screening," he said curtly. "ID now." Naomi frowned but complied, fishing her passport from her bag. She handed it over, expecting the encounter to last no more than a few seconds. Instead, the officer frowned deeply as he flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing at the gold-embossed crest on the front. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, beckoning a second officer over. "What do you mean?" Naomi asked, her unease growing. The second officer, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, examined the passport briefly before whispering something to her colleague. Naomi couldn't make use of the words, but the man's expression hardened. "This is fake," he said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. Naomi's stomach dropped. "Excuse me? You heard me?" the officer said, his voice louder now. "This passport is counterfeit. We can't let you board this flight." "What are you talking about? I've traveled with this passport for years. It's issued by the United Nations." The officer smirked. Sure it is. Where's your real passport? Or is that fake too? Now, standing in the middle of the terminal with her shredded passport on the floor, Naomi felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. The humiliation stung, but more than that, she was furious. How could this happen to someone in her position? Pick that up, she said through clenched teeth, pointing at the torn pages. The officer ignored her, motioning for the cuffs again. Enough of this. You're coming with us. Naomi didn't move, her voice rising. This is a mistake. I need to call my office. The officer cut her off. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself at the station. As the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Naomi's mind raced with questions. Who would believe her now? The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Naomi's wrists as the officer tightened them. Her anger was quickly being replaced by an overwhelming sense of disbelief and frustration. She glanced around at the growing crowd, noticing the flashes of cell phones recording the incident. She hoped someone would capture what was happening, evidence she might need later. The officers flanked her, one gripping her arm firmly, guiding her toward a small holding room near the terminal security office. Naomi resisted the urge to lash out, knowing it would only make things worse. Instead, she focused on keeping her head high, refusing to let the humiliation show on her face. The smaller room was sterile, its white walls lined with plastic chairs and a single table in the center. The female officer, the one who had inspected her passport earlier, stood guard near the door. The other officer, the one who had torn her passport, took a seat at the table and motioned for Naomi to do the same. You're going to tell us where you got that passport, he demanded, his voice firm but low enough to keep from drawing attention outside. Naomi met his gaze, her fury barely concealed. I've already told you, it's real and it's issued by the United Nations. If you don't believe me, call the UN headquarters in New York. They'll confirm everything. The officer leaned back, crossing his arms. You expect me to believe you're a diplomat? He snorted. I've seen some stories in my time, but this one takes the cake. Naomi didn't flinch. Believe what you want. The truth doesn't change. For a moment, the officer studied her, as if looking for a crack in her confidence. When he found none, he stood abruptly and left the room. The silence that followed was oppressive. Naomi shifted in her seat, her wrists aching against the cuffs. The female officer glanced at her briefly but said nothing. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging in her chest. She thought about her parents, who had always told her to carry herself with dignity, no matter the situation. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher, and her father, a postal worker, had raised her to believe she could achieve anything through hard work and persistence. They would be horrified to see her like this. Minutes ticked by. Naomi's thoughts turned to her colleagues at the UN. Would anyone notice she was missing? Could she count on them to intervene? She didn't want to appear weak, but she also knew she needed to find a way to contact someone, anyone who could help her. The door opened, breaking the tense quiet. The male officer returned carrying a phone. He placed it on the table in front of Naomi. You said you want to call your office, he said gruffly. Here's your chance. But don't think for a second that we're letting you off the hook. Naomi hesitated, surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor. She didn't trust his motives, but she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. She quickly recited the number for the UN's emergency diplomatic line, hoping someone on the other end would pick up. The officer dialed the number and placed the phone on speaker. Naomi listened anxiously as it rang, her heart pounding in her chest. United Nations Operations Center. This is Julia speaking, a crisp voice answered. Julia, this is Naomi Carter. I need assistance immediately, Naomi said, her voice steady but urgent. I'm being detained at the airport under false accusations. They've torn up my passport and claim it's fake." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Ms. Carter, can you confirm your UNID number for verification?" Naomi quickly rattled off the number. Julia's tone shifted immediately. "Thank you. Stay where you are, Ms. Carter. We're escalating this matter and we'll have someone on site as soon as possible." The officer reached for the phone, ending the call abruptly. He didn't say anything, but the flicker of unease in his eyes didn't escape Naomi's notice. Back in the terminal, the video of Naomi's passport being torn had already made its way onto social media. Several bystanders had uploaded the clip, tagging prominent activists, journalists, and even the United Nations official accounts. One of the videos, showing the officer's smug expression as he tore the passport, quickly began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, many expressing outrage and disbelief. How does something like this happen in 2024? Imagine tearing a UN diplomat's passport because you think it's fake. The audacity. This is exactly why we need better accountability for law enforcement. Unbeknownst to Naomi, her name had already started trending online. Inside the holding room, the atmosphere remained tense. Naomi could tell the officers were growing uneasy, though they tried to hide it. The male officer was pacing now, glancing at his phone every few minutes. Suddenly, the door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. The officer stiffened, clearly recognizing him. "What's going on here?" the man demanded, his voice low and firm. The male officer hesitated. "We're handling a potential fraud case?" This woman presented a counterfeit passport. The man turned to Naomi, his piercing gaze softening slightly as he took in her handcuffed wrists. "You're Miss Carter?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes, and I have nothing to hide." The man's jaw tightened as he turned back to the officers. "Release her. Now." The officers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. The female officer stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs with a faint click. Naomi rubbed her wrists, resisting the urge to glare at them. "Who are you?" the male officer asked, his tone defensive. The man pulled out a badge, holding it up for both officers to see. Whatever was on it made their faces pale. "Let's just say I'm someone you don't want to cross," the man said coolly. Before the officers could respond, the man turned to Naomi. "Miss Carter, you're free to go. I apologize for this inconvenience." But Naomi wasn't ready to let it go so easily. "You think an apology is enough?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. "You'll have your chance to speak. Trust me." As they left the holding room, Naomi couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and lingering anger. She had no idea who the man was or what strings he had pulled, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Naomi stepped out of the holding room, her back straight and her expression controlled, but inside, she was simmering with frustration. The man in the dark suit walked beside her, his stride purposeful. People in the terminal were still watching, some openly recording her on their phones. Naomi resisted the urge to cover her face. She had nothing to be ashamed of. When they reached a quieter section of the terminal, the man stopped and gestured to a row of chairs. "Miss Carter, please sit. I need to make a call," he said. Naomi hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but exhaustion got the better of her. She sat down, crossing her arms protectively. The man stepped a few feet away, pulling out his phone and speaking in hushed tones. She couldn't make out the words, but his tone was clipped, and he glanced at her occasionally as he spoke. She took the moment to process what had just happened. She was furious at the officer's blatant disrespect and at the humiliation of being accused and detained in such a public manner. But more than that, she was determined to make sure this incident didn't disappear into silence like so many others. The man finished his call and returned, his expression unreadable. Reinforcements are on their way, he said simply. Your colleagues at the UN are aware of the situation and are taking action. Who are you? Naomi asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The man gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. I work for a branch of the government that ensures situations like this are properly handled. Properly handled? Naomi repeated, narrowing her eyes. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Those officers tore up my passport, humiliated me, and treated me like a criminal. How is that proper? His smile faded. You're right. It's not. And I assure you, there will be consequences. But for now, my priority is ensuring your safety and resolving this incident. Naomi didn't respond. She wasn't ready to trust him or anyone else involved in this mess, but she decided to play along for the moment. Back at the gate, the officers who had detained Naomi were becoming increasingly nervous. The crowd had grown larger, and the murmurs of discontent were turning into outright accusations. You better hope she sues you, one bystander called out. Ripping up someone's passport? That's got to be illegal, shouted another. The male officer was trying to maintain his composure, but his reddening face betrayed his discomfort. The female officer whispered something to him, and he nodded curtly. Suddenly, a small group of airport officials arrived, accompanied by two men in suits carrying briefcases. One of the officials approached the officers, her expression stern. We need to discuss this matter immediately, she said, leading them away from the crowd. Naomi was still seated when the man in the dark suit received another call. He listened intently for a moment, then nodded. Good, he said, before hanging up. What's happening? Naomi asked, standing up. A representative from the UN is on their way to speak with airport authorities. In the meantime, I've requested the footage of your interaction with the officers. That alone should be enough to clear your name. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Clear my name? I don't need my name cleared. I didn't do anything wrong. The man held up a hand. Poor choice of words. What I meant is, we'll have the evidence we need to hold those officers accountable. Before Naomi could reply, a new figure appeared, a tall black man in a crisp suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His presence was commanding, and Naomi immediately recognized him. It was Andrew Harper, one of the UN's top legal advisors. Ms. Carter, Andrew said, extending a hand. I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right? Naomi shook his hand, and grateful to see a familiar face. I'm fine, just angry. Andrew nodded, his expression grim. Understandable. Let's get this sorted out. He turned to the man in the dark suit. You must be Mr. Kane, he said. I've been briefed on your involvement. Thank you for assisting. Kane inclined his head. It's my job. Andrew's focus shifted back to Naomi. I've already spoken to the airport's legal team. They're reviewing the situation, but given the evidence we have, including the eyewitness accounts and videos circulating online, I'm confident this will be resolved in your favor. Naomi appreciated his confidence, but she wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. And what about the officers? They can't get away with this. Andrew's expression hardened. They won't. I promise you. The three of them made their way to a private conference room where a group of airport officials and law enforcement representatives were gathered. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone trying to avoid eye contact with Naomi as she entered. Andrew wasted no time. He placed his briefcase on the table and began laying out documents and a tablet displaying the now viral video of the incident. This video shows my client's passport being destroyed by one of your officers, he said, his voice calm but firm. It also shows clear evidence of racial bias in their treatment of her. Ms. Carter is not only innocent of any wrongdoing, but she is also a United Nations diplomat. Her passport was legitimate, and your officers had no right to confiscate it, let alone destroy it. One of the airport officials, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression, spoke up. We're aware of the severity of this situation, Mr. Harper. We're conducting an internal investigation, and appropriate actions will be taken. That's not good enough, Andrew replied sharply. Miss Carter's reputation has been damaged, and she has suffered immense humiliation. This cannot be swept under the rug. The room fell silent. Naomi could feel the tension rising, but she refused to back down. Finally, one of the law enforcement representatives, a senior officer with a stern face, cleared his throat. We'll need more time to review the evidence before making any formal decisions. But rest assured, we take these allegations seriously. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her patience wearing thin. You destroyed my passport and treated me like a criminal in front of dozens of people, she said, her voice steady but fierce. I deserve more than assurances. I deserve accountability. The senior officer looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Andrew leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You'll have 24 hours to provide a formal response. If not, we will escalate this to the highest levels, both domestically and internationally. The room grew even quieter. Naomi could see the unease in the officials' faces, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they left the conference room, Andrew turned to her. This is far from over, but you handled yourself well in there. Naomi nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. I just want justice, Andrew, not just for me, but for anyone else who's been treated like this. You'll get it, Andrew said firmly. But as they made their way back toward the terminal, a loud commotion near the gate caught their attention. Naomi's heart sank as she realized the situation was about to take another turn. The loud commotion near the gate drew the attention of Naomi, Andrew, and Mr. Kane. As they approached, they saw a crowd gathered around a heated argument. The two officers who had detained Naomi stood in the center, their faces visibly red, arguing with a group of airport security personnel. Several passengers were filming the scene, their cameras aimed directly at the officers. Naomi instinctively stopped, unsure of what was happening. Andrew and Mr. Kane exchanged a look before stepping forward, with Naomi close behind. What's going on here? Andrew demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. One of the security personnel turned toward him, relief evident on his face. These officers tried to detain another passenger, he explained, but it seems they've overstepped their authority again. This time, people intervened. Naomi's chest tightened. Another passenger? A woman stepped forward from the crowd, a young black mother holding a toddler on her hip. Her voice was shaky but resolute as she pointed at the male officer. He accused me of stealing someone else's ticket. He said I didn't look like I could afford it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Naomi felt her anger reignite. She clenched her fists, her fury toward the officers now reaching a boiling point. The male officer held up his hands defensively. She was acting suspiciously. I was just doing my job. That's what you call this? Naomi said, stepping into the circle. Her voice carried, and the crowd parted to let her through. Because it looks to me like you're targeting people who look like me. Again. The officer's face darkened. This has nothing to do with you. Naomi let out a bitter laugh. It has everything to do with me. You tore up my passport, humiliated me, and accused me of fraud. And now you're harassing another innocent woman? Don't you see the pattern here? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. The female officer, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. Let's not escalate this further, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Andrew stepped forward, his presence commanding. It's far too late for that, he said coldly. He turned to the security personnel. Has this incident been documented? Yes, one of them replied, holding up a tablet. We've got footage from the security cameras and statements from witnesses. Good, Andrew said. Make sure it's preserved. Well, be adding this to the growing list of grievances against these officers. The male officer, too, okay, a step back, his defiance giving way to visible unease. I was just following protocol, he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Protocol? Naomi shot back. Since when does protocol involve tearing up passports or accusing mothers of theft without evidence? You're hiding behind excuses to justify your bias, and we're not going to let you get away with it. The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still recording. At that moment, a tall man in an airport official's uniform arrived, accompanied by two plainclothes individuals who exuded authority. The official raised his hands to quiet the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we understand your concerns, and we are addressing the situation," he said, his tone calm but firm. He turned to the officers. "You two, come with me. Now." The male officer hesitated, but the female officer grabbed his arm and whispered something to him. Reluctantly, they followed the official, disappearing into a nearby office. The tension in the air lingered as the crowd began to disperse, though many people lingered, watching Naomi with a mix of admiration and sympathy. Naomi turned to the young mother, who was now sitting on a nearby bench, trying to soothe her fussy toddler. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. The woman nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. "Thank you for speaking up. I didn't know what to do. You shouldn't have to do anything," Naomi said, her voice soft but firm. "This shouldn't happen to anyone." Andrew crouched down to the woman's level. "Well, make sure your story is included in our report," he said. "Do you have someone you can call for support?" The woman nodded. "My sister's on her way." As Andrew and the woman exchanged contact information, Naomi's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that this incident wasn't just about her, or even the young mother. It was part of a larger problem, one that demanded systemic change. Back in the airport's administrative offices, the two officers were being questioned by senior officials. The male officer was visibly nervous, his confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. The female officer maintained her composure but said little, choosing her words carefully. Unbeknownst to them, their actions had triggered an emergency review by both airport management and the local police department. The video evidence and public outcry had reached far beyond the terminal, sparking calls for accountability from activists and political leaders. Hours later, Naomi was finally cleared to board her flight. Andrew and Mr. Kane escorted her to the gate, ensuring there were no further complications. As she prepared to board, Andrew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is over," he said. "We'll make sure those officers are held accountable, and we'll ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Naomi nodded, though her emotions were still raw. "Thank you," she said quietly. As she walked down the jet bridge, she couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering frustration. She was glad to be leaving, but she knew the fight wasn't over. As the plane took off, Naomi stared out the window, her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't just a victim of injustice. She was determined to be part of the solution, but she had no idea what awaited her when she landed. Naomi's flight touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport late in the evening. She had spent most of the journey replaying the events at the previous airport, her emotions swinging between anger, disbelief, and determination. As soon as the plane landed, her phone lit up with dozens of missed calls, texts, and notifications. She scrolled through the messages, noting a mix of concern and outrage from her colleagues and friends. One message, however, stood out. It was from a fellow Diplomat, Rachel Wright, who worked closely with Naomi at the United Nations. "Naomi, call me as soon as you land. There's been a huge response to what happened. It's all over the news." Naomi's stomach tightened. She quickly called Rachel, holding the phone to her ear as she collected her carry-on bag. "Naomi, Rachel's voice was urgent. Are you okay? I can't believe what happened. I'm fine, Naomi said, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. I'm just glad to be back. What's going on? Rachel took a deep breath. The videos of the officers tearing up your passport and the incident with the young mother went viral. The media picked it up, and now it's a national story. People are demanding answers. Naomi's eyes widened. National story? I didn't think it would get this much attention. It's not just national, Rachel continued. International news outlets are covering it too. The UN Secretary General has already issued a statement condemning the incident and demanding an investigation. And the police department and airport management are scrambling to contain the fallout. Naomi sank into a nearby seat, overwhelmed by the news. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet, Rachel reassured her. But you should know there's a press conference tomorrow. The UN wants you to speak. They think your voice will be crucial in addressing this issue. Naomi's heart raced. A press conference? Rachel, I don't know if I'm ready for that. You don't have to decide now, Rachel said gently, but think about it. This could be your chance to demand real change. Naomi thanked her friend and ended the call, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected the incident to garner so much attention, and the idea of speaking out in such a public way was daunting. But she also knew this was bigger than her. The next morning, Naomi woke to find her face plastered across every major news outlet. Headley. Inez ranged from UN diplomat harassed at airport to racial profiling sparks outrage after diplomat's passport destroyed. Her phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages from reporters, activists, and even strangers offering support. It was overwhelming, but it also fueled her resolve. By mid-morning, Naomi arrived at the UN headquarters in Manhattan, where she was met by Rachel and a small group of colleagues. They guided her to a private meeting room where she was greeted by the Secretary General himself, a tall man with a commanding presence and a warm smile. Ms. Carter, he said, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances. Naomi shook his hand, humbled by his presence. Thank you for your support, sir. I appreciate it. He nodded. Your courage has inspired many. The press conference this afternoon is an opportunity to turn this tragedy into a catalyst for change. But the decision to speak is entirely yours. Naomi hesitated. What should I say? Speak your truth, the Secretary General said simply. Share your experience and remind the world why this kind of injustice cannot be tolerated. His words resonated with Naomi. She nodded, feeling a sense of clarity for the first time since the ordeal began. By the time the press conference began, the UN headquarters was surrounded by reporters, cameras, and a growing crowd of supporters. Inside, Naomi stood at a podium flanked by the Secretary General and Andrew Harper. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. Naomi took a deep breath as the cameras flashed. Her voice was steady as she began to speak. Good afternoon. My name is Naomi Carter, and I am a United Nations diplomat. Just days ago, I experienced an act of injustice that has left me shaken but not silenced. What happened to me and to the young mother who was harassed after me is not an isolated incident. It is part of a broader problem that affects countless individuals, particularly people of Olor, every single day. When the officers destroyed my passport and accused me of fraud, they didn't just attack my identity. They attacked the principles of equality and dignity that I have dedicated my career to upholding. This is just my fight. It's a fight for everyone who has ever been judged, mistreated, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. It's a fight for accountability, for justice, and for a world where no one has to endure what I did. The room erupted in applause as Naomi stepped back from the podium. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the journey was far from over. As she left the press conference, flanked by her colleagues and supporters, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a victim of injustice. She was a voice for change. But as she stepped into the sunlight, her phone buzzed with a new notification that hinted at another twist in the story. It wasn't over yet. Naomi glanced at her phone. The notification was an email from Andrew Harper, marked urgent. She opened it as she walked, her heart racing as she read the subject line, "New development, officers' backgrounds uncovered." She stopped in her tracks, her colleagues pausing with her. "What is it?" Rachel asked, noticing the change in Naomi's expression. "Andrew just sent me something." "Apparently, there's more to the story about those officers," Naomi replied, forwarding the email to Rachel before stepping aside to read it in full. The email detailed an investigation into the two officers involved in Naomi's ordeal. Journalists and independent watchdog groups had uncovered disturbing patterns in their conduct. The male officer, identified as Officer Tom Collins, had been the subject of multiple complaints for excessive force and racial profiling. The female officer, identified as Officer Sarah Blake, had also been implicated in several incidents, but H. had avoided formal disciplinary action due to insufficient evidence. But the most shocking revelation was a leaked internal report showing that both officers had been flagged for retraining due to unresolved bias complaints just weeks before the incident with Naomi. Yet, they had remained on active duty. Naomi felt a wave of anger and frustration. "They shouldn't have even been on duty that day," she said aloud. Rachel nodded grimly. "This could be huge. If the public finds out, it's going to put even more pressure on the airport and law enforcement." Andrew joined them moments later, his face serious. "I just got off the phone with one of the reporters who broke the story," he said. "The pressure on the department is mounting. They're holding a press conference later today, but I wouldn't be surprised if they try to spin this in their favor." Naomi frowned. "They can try, but the evidence is clear. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about a broken system that protects people like them." Andrew nodded. "Exactly. And that's why we need to stay ahead of this. I've already spoken to some of our allies in the legal and activist communities. They're planning a rally outside the airport tomorrow to demand accountability." Naomi hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be at the center of such a public demonstration, but she also knew this was an opportunity to amplify the message she had started. "I'll be there," she said firmly. Later that evening, Naomi returned to her apartment, exhausted but unable to relax. She scrolled through her social media feeds, watching as the story continued to dominate headlines. Messages of support poured in from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. But there were also detractors, people who questioned her story, accused her of playing the race card, or claimed she was seeking attention. Naomi tried to ignore them, but their words stung. She closed her laptop and leaned back on her couch, closing her eyes. The events of the past few days played over in her mind, and for a moment, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. A sudden knock at the door broke her thoughts. Naomi hesitated before getting up to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Andrew standing there, holding a folder. "Andrew, what are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. "I didn't want to send this over email," he said, stepping inside. He handed her the folder, his expression serious. "This is from a confidential source. It's about the officers." Naomi opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Her eyes widened as she realized the contents were far more damning than she had expected. The documents included internal memos and emails showing that senior officials had been aware of the officers' problematic behavior for years but had consistently downplayed or dismissed complaints to avoid bad press. "This changes everything," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded. "It does. But it also raises the stakes. If we go public with this, They're going to come after us hard. Are you ready for that? Naomi took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I didn't come this far to back down now. Let's do it. The next day, Naomi arrived at the rally outside the airport. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Naomi and End Racial Profiling." The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. As Naomi stepped onto the makeshift stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. She looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all united in their demand for change. Naomi gripped the microphone, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you for being here today," she began. "This rally is not just about what happened to me. It's about every person who has been judged, harassed, or mistreated because of the way they look. It's about a system that allows people like those officers to stay in positions of power despite repeated warnings. And it's about the responsibility we all have to fight for justice and equality." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy fueling Naomi's words. She continued, laying out the systemic issues that had led to her ordeal and calling for concrete changes, including independent oversight of law enforcement and stronger protections against racial profiling. As she stepped back from the microphone, Naomi felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt since the ordeal began. She wasn't just a victim, she was part of a movement. But as the rally continued, Andrew approached her, his face tense. "Naomi," he said quietly, "we just got word that the officers are planning to speak at the press conference in an hour. They're claiming they were following direct orders." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Direct orders? From who?" Andrew shook his head. "We don't know yet, but it looks like this goes even deeper than we thought." Naomi stared at him, her mind racing. If the officers were telling the truth, the implications could be explosive. And once again, she found herself standing on the edge of another storm. Naomi's thoughts churned as Andrew's words sank in. Direct orders? It suggested that the officers' actions were not just the result of individual bias, but part of a larger, more systemic issue. As the rally roared on behind her, Naomi pulled Andrew aside, her voice low but urgent. "We need to find out who gave those orders and why," she said. "If this is bigger than the officers, we can't let it slide." Andrew nodded. "I agree, but we have to tread carefully. If we accuse the wrong people without lid proof, it could backfire." Naomi clenched her fists, frustration mounting. "Then let's make sure we have proof. Do we know anyone who might have access to the airport's internal communications?" Andrew paused, then his eyes lit up. "Actually, yes. A contact of mine in the aviation authority might be able to help. Let me make a call." As Andrew stepped away to call his contact, Naomi returned to the rally. The energy of the crowd buoyed her spirits, but the unanswered questions weighed heavily on her. An hour later, as the rally began to wind down, Andrew returned with a grim expression. "My contact came through," he said, holding up his phone. "They sent me copies of internal emails exchanged between airport security and local law enforcement on the day of your detention. You need to see this." Naomi scanned the emails, her eyes widening with each line. The messages revealed that a senior airport official had issued a directive to officers to increase scrutiny of passengers who appeared suspicious. While the directive didn't explicitly mention race, the examples given, travelers with unfamiliar credentials or unconventional routes, were thinly veiled proxies for racial profiling. One email stood out. It was addressed to Officers Collins and Blake just hours before Naomi's arrival. The subject line read, "Special priority, check all unusual documentation." Naomi felt her stomach churn. "They were set up to target people like me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded. "This goes all the way to the top. If we expose this, it could implicate senior officials at the airport and even the police department. Naomi's resolve hardened. Then we have to expose it. People need to know the truth. By the time the officers' press conference began, Naomi and Andrew were already working with journalists to release the damning emails. Sitting in a small conference room with Rachel and a few other allies, Naomi watched the press conference unfold on a large screen. Officer Collins, looking uncharacteristically subdued, stood at the podium. His partner, Officer Blake, stood beside him, her expression carefully neutral. "We deeply regret the incident involving Ms. Carter," Collins began, his voice measured. "However, we were following direct orders from airport management to scrutinize passengers with irregular documentation. Our actions were not motivated by personal bias, but by instructions given to us as part of our duties." The room erupted in murmurs, reporters firing off questions. Collins raised his hands to quiet them. "We understand the public's concern and welcome an independent investigation into the directives we received," he said. Naomi stared at the screen, her anger simmering. The officers were deflecting blame, but their statement confirmed the existence of the directive. "Cowards," Rachel muttered. "They're throwing their bosses under the bus to save themselves." Andrew leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Let them dig their own graves. Once the emails hit the public, no one will be able to deny what's really going on." Less than an hour after the press conference ended, the emails were published online by a major news outlet. The article, titled "Leaked Emails Reveal Racially Biased Directives at Major Airport," quickly went viral, reigniting outrage on social media. The emails were damning. They painted a picture of systemic bias embedded in airport protocols, implicating not only the officers but also senior management. Activists, politicians, and journalists began calling for immediate resignations and comprehensive reform. Naomi watched the fallout unfold with a mix of satisfaction and weariness. She knew this was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The next day, Naomi was invited to a live television interview to discuss the revelations. Dressed in a simple yet elegant blaze, she sat across from the host in a brightly lit studio. "Ms. Carter, thank you for joining us," the host began. "The leaked emails have shocked the nation. What was your reaction when you first saw them?" Naomi took a deep breath. "I wasn't shocked," she said. "I was angry, but not surprised. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a broader culture that tolerates discrimination and excuses bias under the guise of security." The host nodded. "What do you hope will come from these revelations?" "I hope it leads to real accountability," Naomi replied. "Not just for the officers who carried out these directives, but for the people who created and enforced these policies. We need transparency, independent oversight, and a commitment to ending systemic discrimination." The interview concluded with a standing ovation from the studio audience, and Naomi left the set feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But as she returned to her car, her phone buzzed with a message from Andrew. "Just got word, senior airport official is resigning, but there's more. Call me ASAP." Naomi's pulse quickened. She had a feeling the fight was far from over. Naomi immediately called Andrew, her heart racing as she stepped into her car. "What's going on?" she asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Andrew's voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. The senior airport official, Margaret Hayes, just announced her resignation. But before stepping down, she released a statement claiming the directives you saw were part of a federal initiative to tighten security after recent events. She's implying that the orders didn't originate with her, but from higher up. Naomi sat back in her seat, her mind spinning. Federal initiative? Is she saying this was a government mandate? That's what she wants people to believe, Andrew said. But there's no evidence to back her claim. This could be an attempt to deflect CT blame or, worse, to cover for someone else. Naomi felt a familiar anger bubbling to the surface, but she took a deep breath to steady herself. What do we do now? We keep the pressure on, Andrew said firmly. We've got public attention, political allies, and the truth on our side. If this goes higher, we'll take it higher. Naomi nodded, though she knew the path ahead would be challenging. Let's meet and plan our next steps. This isn't over. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Naomi became a central figure in the growing movement for accountability and reform in airport security and law enforcement. She testified before Congress, sharing her story and presenting evidence of systemic bias in security protocols. Her testimony was met with widespread support and led to calls for an independent investigation into airport management practices across the country. The pressure on federal agencies mounted, and eventually, internal audits revealed that while there had been no official federal mandate for racial profiling, there were implicit biases in how security measures were communicated and implemented. Naomi's case became a catalyst for overhauling these practices, with new guidelines emphasizing fairness, transparency, and accountability. One sunny afternoon, Naomi sat in her office at the United Nations headquarters, sifting through a stack of papers. Her phone buzzed with a notification, and she glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. Final report on airport security scandal released. Sweeping reforms announced. She clicked on the article, her chest tightening as she read. The report detailed the changes being implemented nationwide, including mandatory bias training for security personnel, independent oversight committees, and a new complaint system designed to hold officers accountable. Naomi leaned back in her chair, a small smile forming on her lips. This was the outcome she had hoped for, not just justice, for herself, but meaningful change that would protect others from similar experiences. Her assistant knocked on the door and entered, holding a thick envelope. "This just came for you," she said, placing it on Naomi's desk. Naomi opened the envelope and found a handwritten note from the Secretary General. "Dear Ms. Carter, your courage and determination have inspired us all. Your story is a reminder of why we do what we do to fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. Thank you for standing strong and showing the world that change is possible. With gratitude, the Secretary General." Tucked inside the envelope was a small certificate of commendation, recognizing her contributions to the United Nations and her role in advocating for justice. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat as she read the words. She thought back to the moment in the airport when her passport was torn, the humiliation and anger she had felt. She had come so far since then, and while the journey had been painful, it had also been transformative. Her phone buzzed again, this time, a text from Rachel. "Celebration dinner tonight? You deserve it." Naomi smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Let's toast to progress." That evening, Naomi sat in a cozy restaurant surrounded by friends and colleagues. The atmosphere was warm and filled with laughter, but as the night wore on, Naomi took a moment to reflect. She knew the fight against systemic bias and discrimination wasn't over. It was a battle that would take years, even generations, to win. But for now, she allowed herself to celebrate a hard-fought victory. As she raised her glass to toast with her friends, Naomi felt a sense of peace and pride. She had turned her pain into purpose, her outrage into action, and in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her dignity but had helped pave the way for a more just and equitable future. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, Naomi felt ready for whatever came next.